Hi, it's Mrs. Vance again, and today we're talking about the immune system. These notes will be kind of an overview of the immune system, and then we'll have another video that talks more about some of the specific cells and activities of the immune system. So the immune system basically is your body's defense against disease-causing agents, against pathogens. And you've got, a lot of different things going on. It's very complex. And so we're going to talk we'll talk a little bit about the non-specific parts of immunity, and then we'll talk about a little bit more about some of the specific things, and then later on we'll have another video about some of the more specific things that happen in the immune system. So all animals have some kind of innate or inborn immunity. These are defenses that act immediately. They act whether there's a known pathogen or not, whether you've encountered the pathogen before. They're very non-specific, and they just are reactions to being of an invasion of some kind. Invertebrate animals have only innate immunity. Things like skin, exoskeleton, various kinds of secretions, things like that. Mostly things that work on the outside of the body. Vertebrate animals also have a couple of more internal tools available in their innate arsenal, in addition to the external things like your mucous membranes in the cilia, in your nose, in respiratory tract, things like that. So the internal defenses like phagocytic cells, natural killer cells, and so forth will come into play only if the external parts are breached. Once something gets into the inside, then you start fighting on the inside as well as the outside. Various kinds of cells are present there. There are, like for instance in this picture, you see a pathogen on the outside. As long as it's outside, it's fine. But once it gets inside, you have some of these cells that can take place. This would be something like a phagocytic cell, like a macrophage or something like that, would actually consume some of the bacteria, break it down and with lysosomes containing enzymes, and then discard the waste, basically. And so that would be a non-specific thing, just because there's something there that's not supposed to be there inside your body. Now, there's when you have some kind of tissue damage, like if you have a cut or a scrape or an injury of some kind like that, there is something called the inflammatory response that comes into play here. And this basically is going to help disinfect the tissues and try to limit the infection from going any further than that area. So the example here that's shown in the pictures is when you get a splinter. When you have any kind of puncture into your skin, that allows bacteria that may be on the surface of the skin or on the instrument or whatever it is that punctures your skin, that could be transferred to the inside of your body. And so there are several things that happen when the tissue is injured. There are cells in the subdermal area of your skin, mast cells and macrophages, that basically send out signaling molecules. The macrophages are phagocytic cells that will start trying to consume as many of those bad guys as they possibly can. The signaling molecules, including things like histamines and things like that, will actually cause the capillaries nearby to widen and become leaky. They kind of move a little bit closer to the center. Once they become a little bit leaky, the neutrophils that are in the capillaries can start oozing out between the cells of the capillaries and start helping consume and get rid of those bad guys and clean up any damaged cells and things like that. And hopefully a lot of that will take care of the preventing an infection. If you've ever had a cut or a scrape or something that developed kind of a pussy area, that's the pus would be the dead phagocytic cells and macrophages and things like that. They were taking care of getting rid of the dead cells as well as the bad guys. This all causes a little bit of swelling, a little bit of redness. You can see in the picture here, there's a little bit of redness to the skin, a little bit of swelling because there's more fluid in the skin. And then as time goes on, the swelling goes down, the injury starts to heal, the redness goes away, things like that. So that's an inflammatory response. I'll post a separate video for you about inflammation that shows you kind of what happens in the inflammatory response. It'll be very informative for you. Now that was innate immunity or inborn immunity. Adaptive immunity is immunity that you acquire, and these are things that are found only in vertebrates, and they're activated after exposure to certain kinds of pathogens. Unlike the inborn innate immunity, the adaptive immunity is going to be different from one person to the next, one organism to the next, because it'll depend on what you've been exposed to. Notice the diagram here shows that the innate immunity is a rapid response. It can happen regardless of what the pathogen happens to be, or whether there's even a pathogen there, but it's your body's defense right there, immediate thing. Whereas the adaptive immunity is a slower response. It takes a little bit of time to build up the defenses that will help protect you in the future. So molecules that elicit what we call an adaptive immune response are called antigens. Antigen means antibody generating, and basically the purpose is to make antibodies, which are immune proteins that your blood cells make in your blood plasma, and they're specific to one particular kind of antigen, and hopefully they will help counter the effects of it and prevent further infection with that organ, with that structure, whatever it happens to be. Infections trigger adaptive immunity, so do vaccinations. They work very much the same way. You can also get immunity passively through other means we'll talk about another time. So your rapid response again is your external barriers, okay? And if those things are breached, then you move toward the slower response, which is the innate or adaptive immunity. The adaptive immunity rather than the innate. And that involves various kinds of blood cells called lymphocytes. And that will produce a defense against pathogens in your body fluids, and also against pathogens inside body cells. You have cells that will actually seek out and destroy infected cells. Another really important thing about this part of your immune system is that there's memory involved here, so that your immune system remembers its exposure to those things in the future and can mount a faster response the next time. One system of your body that's intimately involved with immunity is the lymphatic system, and it's involved in both the innate and adaptive immunity. There's a branching network of vessels called lymphatic vessels throughout your body. You can see in the picture here. There are they collect tissue fluid that is called lymph, and it'll be taken back to the bloodstream as necessary. There are also lymph nodes. You can see concentrated in several areas: in the groin area, under your arms, and in your neck area by your tonsils. The lymph nodes are little organs that are packed with macrophages and lymphocytes, and they are important to developing your adaptive immunity. The lymph organs, the lymph nodes, have all these various lymphocytes and macrophages in there, and they can form a specific response to something. So the lymphatic system is really important for returning the tissue fluid back to the bloodstream as needed, but also definitely to fight infection. Lymphocytes are cells that originate from stem cells in the bone marrow. And there are a couple of different kinds. There are B cells and T cells. B lymphocytes or B cells, they continue and finish developing in the bone marrow, whereas the T lymphocytes or the T cells start developing in the bone marrow, and then they migrate to the organ called the thymus, which is in your chest, just above your heart, and they finish developing in the thymus. But both of these cells can work together to work against infections, both in the proteins, the antibodies that are produced in your bloodstream, as well as cells that will attack cells that are already infected, to try to get rid of the infection. There are lots and lots of different kinds of B cells and T cells. Your book says millions of kinds, and I believe that to be true. Each one has a different kind of receptor on the surface of the membrane. And basically they're sitting there in the lymphatic system, in the lymph nodes, waiting to be activated. When you have a macrophage or another kind of cell called a dendritic cell that actually is able to attack a particular pathogen, they present antigens on their surface to activate these cells in the lymphatic system to make them make receptors specific to that particular pathogen. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the next video. But one of the adaptive responses is the humoral response, which works in making antibodies. This involves the B cells. B cells make antibodies. The antibodies will attach to the antigens in the body fluid and help keep those antigens from continuing to cause problems. The second type is called the cell-mediated immune response, and that involves T cells. T cells are able to attack attack infected cells and actually kill them. There's some T cells called cytotoxic or killer T cells that will actually punch holes in infected body cells to kill the cell before the pathogen has the chance to develop more or divide more frequently and make more copies of itself. And that helps prevent infections there. There's also a type of T cell called the helper T cell that activates pretty much your whole immune system to do what it needs to do. So what do antibodies do? Antibodies are molecules that are kind of shaped like a Y, and they have specific receptors on the ends of the Y, and they can attach to antigens and inactivate them by various means. They can block the binding sites of viruses to your cells. If you block those binding sites, then the viruses can't attach to your cells, and therefore that prevents infection from occurring. They can coat bacteria on the outside and make them clump together so that they're more easily recognized and consumed by the phagocytic cells. They can also cause antigens that are dissolved in the plasma or the cell fluid to actually come out of solution and become solid and therefore more easily disposed of. And then they also can encourage macrophages to engulf the harmful things, to eat them up so that they're no longer harmful to your body. So here's a pictorial representation basically of what we're talking about there. So neutralizing viruses and bacteria by attaching to their surfaces, causing them to clump together and be more easily consumed by the phagocytic cells. They can cause the dissolved antigens to precipitate or come out of solution, also being consumed by the phagocytic cells. And then another thing that they can do is activate the complement system, and that's a series of chemicals that are released by certain kinds of cells in your immune system that'll actually cause infected cells to lyse or break down so that they can no longer support the growth of the bacteria or the virus, whatever it happens to be. There are two different responses, and we'll talk a little bit more about the specifics on the next video, but the first exposure to the antigen results in what we call a primary immune response. It takes a little bit of time to happen because your body's never encountered that particular pathogen before. But what it does is it produces the B cells and T cells, okay, both of which produce a certain kind of cell called memory cells. And the memory cells actually remember or have the specific binding sites for those particular pathogens. And so the second time you're exposed to that pathogen, they can jump into play a lot more quickly. This is why a lot of times we have to have 2 injections. We have to have a booster shot for various kinds of vaccines that you get. The first vaccine causes that primary response, and then a certain period of time later, if you expose the body again to the same pathogen or the same antigens, then that will cause a faster, stronger response, also with a longer memory. And so basically that actually activates both the cells, like the ones that are producing the antibodies, as well as memory cells that will hang around longer in the bloodstream to remember that pathogen the next time. This is a graph that shows kind of what happens in the immune response. And so you've got you're exposed first of all to this antigen X, whatever it happens to be. And so over the course of a week or so, your body produces antibodies, a pretty good level of antibodies to that pathogen. But after a few more weeks, it kind of decreases the amount. It depends on what the pathogen is and what the response is. But after a period of time, this shows about a month. Then if you get another exposure to that, it causes a much higher response. And not only does it cause a higher response, it causes it faster, and it also maintains the memory of that response a lot longer. And so that's responsible, like it says in the question here, it's responsible for that greater response the second time because you've already got something there that it recognizes, and it doesn't have to start from scratch to develop the immunity. And this is why we have to have booster shots a lot of times to develop that higher, longer lasting, stronger immune response to whatever the pathogen happens to be. Now, one thing that we've heard quite a bit about in recent days in response to the coronavirus and the vaccines that are becoming available more and more is something called herd immunity. Herd immunity can help prevent the outbreak of infectious disease. There are always some individuals in the population who cannot be vaccinated, whether they're babies that don't have a strong enough immune system to get a response yet, whether they're people that are immune compromised because they've had cancer or some other kind of autoimmune disease. They can't be vaccinated for some reason. If you have a large enough proportion of the population that is vaccinated or is immune to the disease, then basically that will kind of help protect the ones that can't be vaccinated, like the baby or like the immune compromised person. And so when you have somebody that comes into that population, in this particular instance, it shows 95% of the population is vaccinated. Then you have an infected person come in. Well, most people around them can't be infected because they're immune to the pathogen, and they can't be infected by it or pass it on. Whereas if you don't have herd immunity, you have some people who are immune because they've been vaccinated or have had the disease, but there are a lot more people who haven't been vaccinated, and that way you can have a greater spread of the disease, and you're more likely to damage or harm those who can't be vaccinated, the babies and the people with compromised immune systems. So it's really important. And the checkpoint question here says, if the number of people in the community who are vaccinated decreases, the chance of a disease outbreak does what? Well, if you decrease the number that are vaccinated, you're going below this 95% level. That means the chance of a disease outbreak increases, because you're more likely to have people who can catch that disease. This has happened a lot in communities where parents have decided not to vaccinate their children against things like measles. And so you have a large population that with fewer and fewer people that are immune to measles, if one person happens to catch it somewhere and bring it back to the community, then you end up with an outbreak that's much larger than it would have been had everybody been vaccinated against that disease. And we're going to stop here. We'll talk more in the next video about the different kinds of immune cells and exactly how some of this works. But this is the last part of this video about the overall basics of the immune system.